Welcome to Awakening Streams, the podcast of One River Zen Meditation Center in Ottawa, Illinois. Hosted by Sensei Michael Brunner. Learn more, donate, and practice with us at oneriverzen.org.
This practice is such a wonderful practice. It's a way of transforming delusion into awakening. But of course, within it, there are a lot of practice forms, and we've adopted some of these forms from the Orient. We've had it move through many, many countries and different places and pick up different flavors on the way. And those practice forms themselves can be kind of beautiful as we immerse ourselves in them. I know that Kosei is working now on setting up a sewing circle so we can work more diligently on our robes and outfitting ourselves in the robes of our tradition, which is wonderful. I think Hohen's on the same path. And we should celebrate those and enjoy it. It's a good way of bringing the practice into our daily lives. But the bigger part of this practice is how it transforms and it uncovers the beauty around us, the things that surround us. It uncovers our true nature, how there's no distinction or separation. Well, it's not always easy to see, particularly when there's people who are suffering, and there's things to be done, and there's this notion of a clock that's always ticking. It's hard for us to keep up. That beauty, that kind of obscures the beauty. One of the things we begin to notice when we practice, if we look carefully at our mind and where our mind goes, we realize that we don't have judgments about a few things. We have judgments about everything, yeah? Absolutely everything we come in contact with. Where do those judgments begin to lie? Those judgments and our labels, they lie on the vista of our perception. They're not some distant, faraway objects that inform what's present. Right? They are what's present. The judgments loom a lot closer and a lot more real than the truth of our interactions. And when that happens, it really obscures the beauty around us. So the question just becomes, what is it that I'm constantly referring to when I talk about shifting our gaze? What is it when I talk about that we're myopic, that we're constantly nearsighted, and our nearsighted vista is covered by the stream of our conscious judgments, thoughts, ideas? When we see rightly, we ourselves begin to drop away. And that transforms the presence that we have. And we begin to recognize our rightful place in this world of all kinds of suffering. We begin to see that we have what it takes to transform it. In your early studies, all of you studied the precepts. And you'll remember at the end of Three Pure Precepts. They're not some stale rules, they're a process. The precepts were cease from evil, practice good for others. Those are the very forms of those three precepts. But of course, once we've been trained to look beyond how those concepts ring, and we begin to recognize there's something hollow here. When we talk about ceasing from evil, that implies there's some dichotomy. That some of the things we come in contact with are evil and some are good. So when we really practice, we begin to see that where we're pointing to evil, there's only one possible thing that could be present that we would identify as evil. And that is when we create some narrative of our lived experience and cling to that narrative and place it above what's actually in front of us. Now, of course, we're going to have judgment, we're going to have labels, and they belong in the vista of our perception. But when we cling to them, when we identify them, when we elevate them, then we walk away from our lives, right? And we live in these judgments. And so to a large extent, our practice moment by moment is to practice this idea of not knowing, of being in a state of perpetual wonder, of asking ourselves over and over again, is that so, when we have the inclination to cling? So in this place of great wonder, we begin to recognize that there's infinite possibilities. The limitations that we impose are imposed because of our judgments and our fixed ideas. We start by releasing our grip on knowing. Then it moves on to practice good. Practice good. Well, if we know by the former precept that the idea here is not to erect some sort of ideological wall that overlays all of our lived experience with labels and ideas, transference and counter-transference, then to practice good is to do what? To constantly be wiping that slate, right, of our judgments and our ideas, or at least recognizing that it's a portion of our lived experience rather than the whole thing, and how it is created. Because when we recognize that we're creating the narrative, then we can create the narrative a little more skillfully, something that more closely resembles what's there, and is helpful for pointing a way out of the delusory ideals back to the truth of this lived experience. Again, it's not easy, but practicing good is staying with it. Some people have expressed it as bearing witness. Being present with it even when it gets hard. Don't walk away. Don't fall into some notion of collapsing it into knowing. Because once we know it, we can tuck it into a box and put it on a shelf. Or in some cases, throw it away. But it doesn't matter. You can throw it away in the garbage, take it out to the curb, have the truck pick it up, take it to the landfill. It's still very much within us. It just moves the location. And that third precept, practice good for others. Well, if we're sitting and we're seeing self and other, then we know that we're creating that gap. And so to a large extent, when we see self and other, compassionate action requires us to eliminate that self-created gap and to step into it. To recognize that when we're seeing through our eyes, or we're seeing the eyes of other, that we're both seeing through, ultimately, the same set of eyes. We begin to see our others reflected in everything we look at. And we can move beyond the self-imposed, limited gap that's created when we say, I. So if someone is hungry, we are hungry. If someone is tired, we're tired. That tired is experienced in the first hand because there is no second-hand perspective. When we do that, then the wisdom manifests for us to take care of, really, ourselves. But ultimately, everything that we come in contact with that we consider other. And it's not on someone else's watch, and it's not someone else's fault. We just look at it and say, this is it. It's not so much important from a labeling perspective that I judge who put this garbage here. I have to pick it up. Right? And then I begin to recognize that this isn't garbage. It's only garbage because of the way we perceive it. We can transform that base material into something that's nourishing. We know how to move forward with skill. There's a case in the Mumonkan, it's the 36th case. It's called Meeting a Man Who's Accomplished the Way. And the case says, Goso said, if you meet a woman on the path who has accomplished the way, don't greet her in words or silence. Tell me, how will you greet her? How will you greet her indeed, yeah? Oh boy, does our discursive mind get tied up with this one right away? Oh boy. We start to overlay pictures of who we think we're greeting. Some hero of the lofty past, one of the esteemed ancestors that shows up. They're always showing up, right? But when we take the pure precepts into account and we immerse it, we begin to recognize, where do we start? We start from this perspective of curiosity and wonder, this perspective of not knowing. What is this before me? Is it really? Is that so? How am I moved by this? But then there's that nagging voice that's trying to break in and say, hey, it's important that you make a good impression, right? So the second pure precept insists that we stay with it, that we see that narrative for what it is. Boy, how important it is that we want to recognize the oneness, that we want to merge subject and object, and have self and other drop away. But what a challenge it is to do. What a challenge it is to do. And so we recognize we've got to stay with it, not let all those judgments creep in. Of course, the last pure precept, practice good for others. Right? Sometimes it's just enough to show that we see, to welcome them into the gap of this interconnectedness. So we start with not knowing. We don't jump to conclusions. We actually sit with our embodied experience. We try to see how we're moved by the circumstances. And then we manifest as compassionate action. And again, there's so much magic in this. We want to cling to some idea of how we're supposed to speak or engage. How much passes in just a glance? How much passes in just a sigh? Just something or a bow that shows that they're known. There's so much there. And yet our culture does value that we speak up. And so it's important that we speak up to verify that we see the circumstances clearly and known. So if we work this approach, if we approach what we consider to be self and other with wonder, enlightenment and delusion, higher and lower, we set all that aside, and we actually just open to the circumstances they present ourselves, then we know how we're moved. And we're able to embody it. It's when we get confused or tripped up in our ideas that things become jumbled. Three Pure Precepts. So not just some idea, it's a practice. And when you look clearly, you'll see yourself reflected everywhere once you embrace these ideals. And when you greet from this place, you truly greet. There's no perfunctory platitude, just what is truly at hand. And even what we consider to normally be a perfunctory platitude or something that's reflexive now becomes something that we fully embrace and embody. You manifest with intention, an intention that can heal all wounds, but also heal all gaps that it comes in contact with. There's no doubt this takes a lot. This takes a lot. As a matter of fact, it'll cost you your life as you see it. But I get to speak to a lot of people in Doksan, and I've come to recognize that most of you don't like the self that you've created very much, even though you're the ones who made it. So it should be a lot easier when we see it in that light to put it down. But we all look at it like a ring, like we're very close to polishing that one last smudge off and having it be how we want it to be. Let me give you a hint. Doesn't matter how many times you polish or aggrandize that self, what else you add to it. It's never going to be enough because it's always going to be other and therefore less than. So just put it away. Just let it go. And just truly show up. Look what there is in exchange. Look what there is in exchange. Look at the life that you gain when you're able to approach it from a state of wonder.
Thank you for joining us. If this podcast was meaningful for you and supported your practice, please give us a hand by visiting us at oneriverzen.org today.